So welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Janine, I don't know if you could let me know. Can you hear me okay? And
crystal clear. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming today. We're going to be talking about the economics of the election, specifically the economic implications of the 2024 candidates' policies. Before I begin, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. Western Washington's University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And with that, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to go over some sort of housekeeping bits. First of all, my name's Adam Wright. I'm in the economics department here at Western. I also direct a center called the Center for Economic and Financial Education. I'd like to give a shout out and thanks our alumni foundation, Eileen McCracken and the League of Women Voters for helping with voter registration. And then I'm part of a larger council called the Council for Economic and Financial Education. And then we have a lot of great support just from the economics department. And of course, our panelists, who I will introduce here in just a moment. So just to lay some groundwork for what's the scope of what we're going to do today. There's sort of three kind of main goals I have. And number one is just to summarize candidates' policies on economic issues. And as you might guess, for some issues, candidates have not been very forthcoming with actual policies. But we have something nice, actually, with both candidates, where we have an administration we can lean on, a prior administration. So we'll sort of use that as sort of to project what we think maybe the policies might be to analyze. And we're going to be very limited in our scope today. It's sort of I've sort of found through this process, it's a very large undertaking to summarize all of the policy implications, all the economic implications of candidates' policies, way too big. So I've had to cut a number of different things. So I'm going to really limit our scope to the topics that sort of best lend themselves to economic analysis, sort of think about costs and benefits. So I'll talk about the things we won't cover. I had to cut, unfortunately, education, health, drug, crime topics, just for the sake of time. Other social issues like reproductive rights, foreign policy as it has to do with wars. We'll talk about foreign policy as it has to do with trade. But certain things we're mostly sort of limited by time. And our goal is to give sort of nonpartisan analysis of policies. There's a lot of sources where you can get told sort of who to vote for. But there's not, I found it sort of in my research for this event that it's hard to actually find people just talking sort of in sort of maybe more technical but less emotional terms about policies. So we're going to try to stick to sort of nonpartisan, sort of, you might say, positive rather than normative analysis. And think about, is there precedence for policies? Are there studies about the effects of some of these policies? And then economists love to talk about unintended consequences. What might be some consequences that the candidates aren't being so forthcoming about? And then lastly, we want to allow for some dialogue. So we're going to reserve at least 15 minutes, hopefully 20 minutes at the end for questions. Some of you submitted questions ahead of time. I've tried to sort of bake those into the presentation. If we didn't get to them or you don't feel like they were answered, please do feel free to ask them at the end. And that goes for people on Zoom as well. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask questions. So what will we be covering today? So we've got really, I would say, 7 big categories, and then we'll sort of summarize all at the end with the federal deficit. So we'll talk about tax, housing, immigration, international trade, agriculture, climate and energy, labor, and then at the end we'll sort of sum things up with how would candidates' policies and our sort of best predictions add to the federal deficit. It's very unlikely that we're not going to get to all of these. I sort of prefer sort of a quality of conversation over quantity, so I apologize if we don't get to some of these. If that's the case and you want to ask questions at the end, please do. And then we'll, again, as I mentioned, we'll reserve some time for Q&A, and then I think we'll still have refreshments, or I'm happy to carry on the conversation out in the atrium afterwards. So for each topic, what are we going to do? There's a little bit of audience participation in here. Sort of baked in here. So let's see, can I move? I don't like this. Get out of here. So first things we got to talk about, what is the context? No candidate policy sort of lives in a vacuum. There's some sort of context, or there's a current policy already in place. I'll sort of spend maybe a slide on that. I will then sort of present one of the candidates' policies, and I'll ask you to actually guess whose policy you think it is. You're going to notice, I think, unless you're a policy expert, I think you're going to find that some of these policies are very obvious who they are, and some actually are not so obvious. Then I will go ahead and give an overview of candidates' policies. We'll talk about what are the sort of the key economic sort of implications or questions we might ask. And then our lovely panel here will give their insights. And let me introduce that panel. We have 4 members. We have Ted Alden from management, who does a lot of our Canadian-American, teaches a lot of our Canadian-American study classes. Hart Hodges, who teaches health, does some labor stuff as well. He runs our Center for, CBER, what's the acronym? Center for, thank you. Zoe Plakius, who teaches, does all sorts of interesting things in energy and agriculture in the economics department. And then our political scientist, Kate Dessler. So let's jump right in. We're going to start sort of like a big overarching policy, tax policy. So there's there's probably 15 categories of tax policy I could talk about. I'm going to mostly focus on sort of individual income tax policy. That seems to be really salient to people, and it's where the federal government gets most of its revenues. So let's just give some very brief context. So tax policy is set by Congress. So this is not something that the president can sort of unilaterally say, this is what I want the tax policy to be. The president does have executive power over one portion of tax policy, and that's tariffs. We're going to come back to that with international trade. So where are we right now with federal income tax policy? So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was signed into law in 2018 during the Trump administration. Those tax cuts expire next year, and in the absence of sort of a new tax policy, things will revert to sort of 2017 levels, and neither candidate is sort of in favor of that. Before I go any further, this is sort of the audience participation round. So if you are comfortable and you have a phone handy, I invite you to go to www.socrative.com. Zoomers, you can also participate in this as well. And then once you go to that website, you'll see a button that says login, and then you just click student login. We're all students today. And then if you just enter the room, WWU 2024 with no spaces, you should be prompted to make a decision to choose one of the other of Harris or Trump. So what are you choosing, Harris or Trump, for? So here's the policy, and I think most people will probably get this one, but let's see. So this candidate's policy could be broadly defined as retaining those 2018 basically marginal tax brackets, except for the top earners, where this candidate proposes to raise the top level from 37% to 39.6%. And then tax capital gains over $1 million at the income tax rate, which I'll show you a quick slide of that, instead of at the capital gains tax rate at 20%. So take a minute, click in. And again, I think this one's probably on the easier end, but these will get, some I think are more difficult. And our panel, you can jump in sort of at any time when I sort of put things up, but we'll also have sort of designated times for the panel talk. So we've got a number of respondents, about 40 people have clicked in, and there's 100% agreement here. Whose policy is this? This is a Harris policy. What was sort of the dead giveaway here? Was there a dead giveaway to anyone? Maybe all of it? Yeah, changing the top income rate, changing sort of how we tax sort of capital gains. So here's just a quick rundown of sort of 4 categories. I'm going to mostly focus on income taxes and capital gains tax, but here's how they compare. And I would just sort of notice, like, at least for income taxes, there's really not a big difference. I'll come back to that in a sec. Really, the only income tax difference that doesn't have to do with capital gains is that sort of top marginal rate from 37% to 39.6%. In terms of child and earned income tax credits, these largely benefit people at sort of the bottom end of the income distribution. Candidate Harris wants to increase these. Trump has basically said no change in these. To give you an example, like, if you have a kid between the ages of 0 and 1, I believe right now the tax credit you get is about $2,000. Harris would bump this up to $6,000, or she's proposed to. Capital gains tax, Trump has not said anything about changing that 20% capital gains tax. This is like if you sell a stock, you pay a tax on sort of the amount of profits you would make on that. Or if you had like a Van Gogh painting sitting in your garage and it went up in value and you sold it. Probably doesn't apply to most of us. There's really big differences, though, here in capital gains, though. Increases, we'll go over what those increases are in just a second, what that would look like. And then corporate taxes, these are basically just taxes on corporate profits. Currently, does anyone know, I'm sure there's accounting students here, does anyone know what the current corporate tax rate is? How much do corporations get taxed on their profits? 21%. Harris has proposed to bump that up to 28%. Trump wants to lower that to 15%. Notice this is all, still all of this is lower than the pre-2017 rate. I believe it was 35% on corporate profits. Why? I'm just going to focus on individual income taxes here kind of for the rest of the time. I invite our panel to comment on whatever you want. The reason is basically half of all federal revenue comes from individual income. And about a fifth of that, so half of it is income taxes, and about a fifth of that, or 20% of that, comes from capital gains. So most of it is income taxes. So as I mentioned, I won't spend too much time on this, except I'm going to note one more thing that I haven't mentioned yet that both candidates are actually in agreement with. Trump proposed it, and then Harris followed up and said, yeah, I'm on board with that too. Maybe you've seen it in the news, is exempting tip income from taxes. And I'll ask our panel to comment on that in just a second. And then, but really the only other change with income taxes is just increasing that top rate from 37% to 39.6%. So this is what the marginal tax brackets look like now for 2024. You get taxed basically on different bins of amount you make. So for example, the first $11,000 you make gets taxed at 10%. The next $35,000 you make or so gets taxed at 12%. Though this is a little bit misleading because the standard deduction is about $14,600 for single filers, which leads to basically like 40-ish% of Americans don't pay any federal income tax. But the only difference between the two, only proposed difference, is Harris is going to bump this up basically close to 40%, or at least proposes to. Now, unlike, the big difference here and a big sort of deviation sort of from how we typically have taxed capital gains is changing, is sort of Harris's proposal to tax gains over $1 million at the income tax rate rather than 20%. So this is sort of, this could be a potentially big windfall for the government if you think about it, because you're basically doubling the tax rate for capital gains over $1 million. So this is like if you made over $1 million in stocks in a year, a good problem to have, but instead of being taxed at 20%, you'd be taxed at closer to 40% essentially. And then this is maybe the most controversial part of the entire tax policy, is Harris's proposal to tax unrealized gains. So you have a stock that goes up in value, but you don't sell it. If the sum of all of those gains in a year adds up to more than $100 million, she proposes a tax of 25% on those unrealized gains. And if you're thinking about, well, okay, it's a lot of money, how many people have this problem? I don't know if this is more or less than you thought, but it's sort of more than I thought. About 10,000 people in 2023 would have been subject to such a tax, the 25% tax. So there's sort of a lot to digest, sort of a lot to chew on here. So I'm going to open it up to our panel to comment on sort of whatever they think or whatever sort of jumps out to them. Maybe we'll start to this first one to the panel. So I have a few questions for you. So this idea of not taxing tips on, not subjecting tip income to income tax rates is sort of gained a lot of popular press. It sort of had a moment for a while. It sort of died down. But I'd like to ask the panel, what do you think? How would this maybe change incentives of workers? Might this change the type of jobs workers work in? Would employers respond in unanticipated ways that the policy doesn't capture? I would open it up to our panel.
Okay, it's on. Can you hear me? Great. So I think the tip income, I think we've all experienced changes in tips and how tipping occurs and are probably pretty perplexed at when we're supposed to tip and whom we're supposed to tip at this point. I don't know if anyone shares that with me. Yeah. So I think this is interesting because it adds another level of confusion to that mix. I mean, I think that what this does is it creates an incentive for you to be in tipped jobs, right? So that you don't have to take that to get that tax. One thing that I've seen noted in analysis of this is that many people who are in jobs that get tips are in a relatively low tax bracket already, so may not be paying taxes. This would probably affect the people who are kind of in a middle income bracket the most, right? Who would have some tax burden, and then this could potentially relieve it. But also there's then an incentive to kind of think there could be jobs that are turned into tip jobs, right? To kind of create loopholes where now if you're trying to say, oh, I want to have a job where there's no tax, then you're going to try to turn some new job into a job that gets tipped, which we know is already happening to some extent, and part of the confusion that we all face. So I'll leave it at that and let anyone else take over.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting, and I think like many people, I heard this proposal and I thought, this is absurd. Why should we tax or why should we tax or not tax tip income different from any other form of income, right? Income is income. I think, I would be remiss as a political scientist to not point out that part of why we're having this conversation is because states like Nevada are in play with very high service sector employment, and building on what Zoe said, in some cases, people who work in the service sector and are making those mid-level salaries where they are facing taxes. I think one of the most interesting pieces that I read about this, though, pointed out, as we posit what might happen if we got rid of taxes on tips, the reality is we sort of know this, because up until 10 or 15 years ago, on the one hand, tips were legally taxed, but most people tipped with cash. And most service workers, or many service workers, did not report that tip income as part of their taxes. It was a kind of an extra piece. I have friends who worked in the service industry, particularly in their mid-20s, who said, my friends don't realize that if they're not reporting this income and they get hurt, they're going to, be in a problem down the line if they need replacement income or unemployment income. But I think one of the other interesting pieces of this is that because we had an industry where a large proportion of service workers' incomes was nominally untaxed for years and years, this, the part of the big switch was the move to increased credit card use really during the pandemic, where everything became plastic. And once tips were collected on credit cards, they were then part of an employee's official income. They then get taxed. Many service workers effectively experienced a pay cut that was tied to this technological change, and one that they couldn't quite negotiate, with clients, with their customers, and say, you need to tip me a little more. This is not what. I think the other quick question, then I'll pass the mic, is not, how does this change incentives? So one argument could be going back to not taxing tips makes sense because it reverts to the norm of how salaries were determined. If we think about restaurant employers estimating a certain level of tip salary and kind of calculating what seems like a fair or market wage. I do think it will be interesting, given that there's been a lot of press about around this, to see what might happen when, if in fact, and we should point out, this is not something that either Harris or Trump can do unilaterally. This would have to be done through legislation, and there's been some legislation that's been proposed. If we have a high-profile removal of tax on tips, how does that affect what I decide to tip someone? Do I suddenly say, you know what, I know we've been moving from 10% to 15% to 20%. That seems like a lot now that I know that it's tax-free. Maybe I'm going to, pull back and not tip as much. And then, and what will that mean, particularly for the low-income workers, as Zoe pointed out, who weren't paying taxes on their tips to begin with? It's really kind of a mixed bag.
I would think you might get employers saying, you just got a raise from the federal government, and now I'm going to pay you less on the stated part of the wage as well. So some of the incentives and the way to game it in different dimensions.
I mean, the only thing on this list I have a bit to comment on is the last one on taxing unrealized capital gains. I do international stuff. There's a long standing now international discussion about whether wealth should be taxed more than it is. We have a huge inequality problem, not just in the United States, but in many other countries. And income, for a variety of reasons, those of you who are in accounting might end up doing this for your careers. Income is easier to shield than wealth. And so one of the arguments for taxing wealth in some form is that it will help reduce inequality, marginally, of course, but it'll go after some of the highest earners and make it more difficult for them to shield income in various ways by moving assets around the world. So that would be a really interesting precedent if the United States were able to do that. I think realistically, the odds in the next administration are pretty much zero. You would have to get a receptive Congress, and that's not likely to happen in the Senate particularly. But to me, that's the most interesting item on this list.
Thank you. I was going to follow up with you, Ted. I think the U.S. relative to other nations, we don't tax consumption nearly as much. There's big value-added tax in other countries. Is this sort of a way to get closer to how other countries sort of taxing ability to pay rather than income?
Not necessarily, because value-added taxes generally are kind of regressive, right? Because they hit everybody who purchases stuff. The advantage of a value-added tax for a government, there's two advantages. One, it's really easy to collect. And two, there are international trade advantages. Value-added taxes are rebatable when you export products. So you actually gain a relative export advantage if you're in a country that charges value-added tax. It's been a source of trade tension between the United States and Europe for a long time now. So I'm not sure VATs really get at the equity issue as much as something like a wealth tax would.
Thank you. So another implication here is, that we didn't maybe potentially get to is that, maybe with capital gains, lower capital gains rate, it's more efficient investment. You can maybe argue that, if you have a lower capital gains rate, that you're not going to just keep money in a bad investment just to offset, so you don't have any tax liability. You have one stock that does really well, one does poorly, but you want to avoid sort of a tax hit. Higher capital gains might make you more likely to hang on to those bad investments. But this, obviously the unrealized part, it's not a matter of whether you sell the stock or not. It would just be the sum of your gains and losses. And then I'm not sure about how practical it would be. I have no idea how practical it would be. But I think, like Ted sort of pointed out, that it seems like income is easier to shield than maybe wealth. And so maybe it's not as impractical as we think. So great. We're going to move on to now housing policy. This is one of, if you sort of look at sort of voters' most pressing issues, housing policy, inflation, and food prices, those are at the top of many people's lists. So let's give some context. Houses, I hope you're not trying to buy a house right now. Houses are an all-time high, largely due to a housing shortage. And we'll talk about a few of the bullet points here that sort of lead to that. Part of it is, there's a really high demand from millennials and Gen Z who are sort of entering the market. Big cohorts that are entering the housing market for the first time. There's been kind of this underproduction of housing for many years, since the Great Recession. Basically, post-Great Recession, 2009, 2010, a lot of home builders went out of business and they sort of never came back, and I'll show you a chart on that. And then there's reasons why, even if we maybe enact policies that sort of spur or are meant to spur sort of an increase in production of housing, there's still sort of potential barriers in terms of restrictive zoning. For example, single-family neighborhoods, think of these as sort of suburbs where you can't have dense housing or multifamily housing. There's a lot of NIMBYism in the housing market. There's a lot of people that are in favor of more housing, but just like not in my neighborhood, just put it over there. But if everybody thinks that way, then it doesn't go anywhere. And then there's sort of cumbersome or timely, time-intensive permitting processes that largely vary by state, and I'll show some evidence of that. But before we get there, I have another question for you. Whose policy is this? To make federally, oops, let me click through to the next question. So we were 100%. Oh, sorry, one person last time guessed Trump. But let's try, oops, let's go to question, oops, let's see. Can I go to question 2? Maybe not, the app doesn't want to work. Well, anyway, let me read the policy. Make federally owned land available for housing development and offer first-time buyers a $25,000 down payment for assistance. Is it showing a question on your end if you're, let's just, oh, it is showing on yours? Okay. Well, click in if you can. I apologize if not. It's mine is frozen. Okay, I apologize for that. I don't know why mine is. I've never had this happen before. Okay, well, I'm going to try again here. So again, this one might be, I don't know, this is probably middle of the road, maybe still on slightly the easier end. If I can get the, is it showing in yours there? Is it showing? I don't know why. Well, maybe I will get off the internet and try.
You can do an old-fashioned show.
We might have to do an old-fashioned show of hands. Hold on, I'm trying one last thing. I just got off the internet. Good old technology. Okay, let me see if I can rejoin. Let's see. How do I get back to my current activity? Okay. Well, I'm going to just relaunch this. I apologize. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we're back and live. It's back to question one. I apologize. Okay, so whose policy is this? Again, people on Zoom, I encourage you to click in. Now, there's probably one dead giveaway on here, but there's sort of, I think, part of this that's not obvious, which we will talk about. I'll give you just another 10 seconds. So we're in mostly agreement. So it's not like 100% or 98 to 2% here. Now it's like 90% to 10%. Anyone like to take a guess? Whose policy is this? This is, again, a Harris policy. And though, I try to throw a loophole, like a test, you try to throw, make it not so obvious. The first bullet point is actually shared by both candidates. The second point is definitely not shared by both candidates. So just a very quick rundown of sort of differences about how Trump versus Harris plans to affect basically housing supply and prices. So for first-time home buyers, Trump has not given a lot of specifics. He's had sort of some general statements like tax incentives and support, whereas Harris has said very specifically her sort of probably most prominent plan would be to give $25,000 down payment assistance to first-time home buyers. There's some other sort of restrictions in there. It's sort of not for everybody. But this was sort of interesting to me. Both, I would thought, if you would have asked me before, I thought maybe this was just a Trump policy, but both Trump and Harris have come out and said they support developing federal land for new housing, though I would say Harris and Trump are very different in how they would implement that. Harris has said she wants to expand basically in metro areas, basically where there already are cities that sort of are adjacent to federal land, to make that federal land open. Trump has talked about building entire new cities on federal land, so where there's nothing currently. So you might think this is more rural development, and this would be more sort of metropolitan or urban. And then there's another policy here we'll talk about, tax incentives for builders. So builders that make so-called starter homes or new homes, she's proposed some tax credits for. In terms of zoning and regulations, you might have seen in the news, Trump has sort of big ideas about saving the suburbs or sort of against zoning regulations in single-family housing areas, not allowing multifamily housing. Harris has not given any specifics here. She said, I'm going to cut red tape to make building houses easier, but it's not clear totally what that means. And then the other thing, I will move our sort of Zoom situation here. For tenant protections, Trump has not said anything about protecting tenants, but he did have an eviction moratorium during COVID or oversaw that. Harris has been more specific. She has proposed to ban algorithmic increases of rental prices. You might have seen this in the news. And then she's proposed cutting tax breaks for corporations that own single-family houses. So just to give you a sense of sort of like that, I don't know what I'd call this, the housing supply deficit. This is sort of housing supply relative to demand, so sort of over time. And again, there's not a great, maybe I can. Yeah, there we go. I should know this by now. It's like we zoomed for so long and then I stopped doing it and I've deleted all that from my brain. But so here's relative surplus of housing over time, relative surplus of housing over time, relative to demand. And then here's sort of the Great Recession where this sort of inflection happens. Here is sort of this big change. And we're sort of sitting at a point of about 3 million fewer houses than sort of single family homes than people sort of demand. And this number is actually sort of important. You're going to see this number, 3 million houses, come up here in just a second again. Trump has not given a lot of policy guidance about what he might do. So I'm just going to take a guess and look at what do like red states versus blue states do. I'll just look at this sort of right-hand graph here. So this is basically showing number of new housing builds per capita in 2022, where more sort of green colors represent sort of more building per capita. The lighter colors, I should say sort of the reddish and I don't know, tannish colors represent less. And there's not a super obvious correlation here, but red states tend to build more or less, have less building restrictions. So Texas and Florida build more than, say, California and New York. But I don't know if I would take too much away from this because there's no policy sort of proposal here. It's just sort of a guess. So I'm going to open up to the panel here. Some basic introduction to economics from the Harris proposal. So let's take a look at just these two Harris proposals. But I invite the panel to talk about whatever they think is sort of relevant here. So there's two big proposals Harris has. One of them is $25,000 in payment assistance for first-time home buyers. And she says she has sort of the stated goal of helping 4 million first-time buyers over the next 4 years. And then at the same time, she's proposed tax incentives for builders who build starter homes. So these would be new builds intended for people who are entering the housing market for the first time. So I don't know the specific, I haven't read the specifics, or I don't know she's actually put out specifics about what would be the threshold of a new starter home, but think mansions, multi-million-dollar mansions probably would not make the cut here. And she has a stated goal to construct 3 million new homes. I don't know where that number exactly comes from, but maybe it's not a coincidence to construct over the next 4 years or why she said 3 million. That just also happens to be sort of our housing deficit. So I'd open up to the panel to maybe comment on some ideas here. So I guess the idea here is to bring down prices and increase the quantity of homes. My question for the panel is do you think these policies would do that, or what effect might they have?
Rather than answer your question, I'll ask I want to urge everybody in the audience to think not about housing as a category. Break the market down, because it's a very different world to talk about housing for the upper end of the income spectrum. Maybe convenient to think about housing. How do we serve the really low income where you need heavily subsidized housing, transitional housing? Let the market handle the upper end. What do you do about the middle? When you think about $200 a square foot or up for a house, what that implies. So I almost want to break this slide into just think about it in different categories, but I won't hog the mic.
Just one quick thought, and then I'll let other folks. We think about housing affordability, and we think about housing prices, and those are not exactly the same thing. My first thought is that giving every first-time home buyer $25,000 in down payment assistance or other kinds of buying incentives will make houses more affordable, but it's not going to do anything to make housing less expensive, because whenever you subsidize buyers, that gives them more purchasing power, which will then fuel the market higher. We talk about this often in higher education and the ways in which aid may fuel higher tuition prices.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing on it. I'm mostly out of the Canada example because I teach a class on Canada's economy. One of the things that's quite striking here is that very little of this is within federal competence. I mean, housing is essentially a state and local issue here in the United States. In Canada, it's a provincial and local issue. So very few of the issues about supply, for example, the regulations surrounding new home building, those are not under federal control. The federal land ideas, but most federal land isn't adjacent to cities. And the federal land that's adjacent to cities is often environmentally protected for one reason or another. So it's hard to see that affecting supply much. Canada has struggled with this every bit as much as the United States has. And if you look at Vancouver and Toronto, it's probably worse. What they are trying to do, and you can see in Vancouver, it's starting to have some effect, is really to begin to make Canadian cities look more like those in the rest of the world. If any of you have traveled at all, cities around the world don't look like American cities, right? People live in much more concentrated areas. They live in apartments and condos, smaller area, these big sprawling single-family homes. It's a very American thing. If you look at what's going on in Vancouver, they have rezoned. So an awful lot of single-family housing neighborhoods in Vancouver now, you can break up your single-family house and turn it into 4 units. And over time, that's going to happen. And they're particularly trying to locate those around transit hubs to try to make it more feasible for people to live without cars or minimize use of cars. It's beginning to have some effect, particularly on rental prices in Vancouver, which is encouraging. But none of this, it seems to me, moves the needle much at all. But Harris knows she needs the vote of young people, and she knows it's a big concern for young voters.
I wanted to mention that one of the things that's happening in the kind of local context is that some of the Climate Commitment Act funds and the Climate Commitment Act through Initiative 2117 is on the ballot in Washington State. Some of those funds are actually funding some of the kinds of projects you're talking about with affordable housing near climate or near transit hubs, including in Whatcom County. So there is some action happening, but as you said, it's not at the federal level, right? I did want to mention too, to Adam's specific question about kind of the responsiveness of supply to price. In the short term, I think it would be very difficult for us to see this, quick response of these houses being built, and so you see primarily the demand effect, where people now that demand is unlocked and people are able to go into the market, but that drives the price up, right? Over time, I would expect if these homes are built, that we would see that kind of that effect abate a little bit. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I was kind of thinking about, having recently bought a house in Whatcom County as a millennial, I felt this is very near and dear to my heart. And I was thinking about the asset building aspect of homeownership. And so 28.5% of aggregate wealth of households in the United States is home equity. And so I think there's also kind of something in here with the down payment assistance related to asset building for home buyers, and that's something that I think Millennial and Gen Z are thinking about. How are we building that wealth through those various assets into the future?
One last comment that goes back to Ted. The supply side is local, but the demand side is subsidized at the federal level. And when you think about mortgage interest, right? So they're not coordinated at all.
And just to echo that or build on that, the federal government traditionally in housing plays they're the purse, and they're the person that can set incentives, and a lot of it is indirect, right? The federal government can create incentives for localities, for states to change their regulatory schemes, to change their funding schemes, but there's, whenever you have those multi-chain policy steps, you have a lot of slippage.
Great, thank you. So next we're going to go to immigration. I'll give a little bit more background here, but there is, unlike, for example, housing, at least on the supply side, the president has a lot of ability to act sort of unilaterally on immigration. I think during his presidency, Trump had, I think, 472 executive actions related to immigration. The unauthorized sort of population in the U.S. peaked at about 12.2 million in 2007, but there's been a sort of a steady decline from then to 2019. Immigrants make up about 14% of the U.S. population. Unauthorized immigrants, 3.3%. But you can see here they're about 4.8% of the workforce, so they're disproportionately more likely to be in the workforce compared to sort of people who were born in the U.S. And you might have seen some of this other stuff in the news. Encounters with migrants at U.S. borders were sort of at record highs in 22, 23. And then asylum seekers were actually, there's basically a million cases in 2023. And, I guess before I go on, I have to have you guess. Let me make sure this is working. I won't put you through another, wait for my technical problems. Okay, now it's working. All right, it's open. Let's see if you can get this one. Who proposes a border emergency authority that allows for immediate removal of asylum seekers if there are greater than 4,000 crosses daily? And also proposes to make it harder for asylum seekers to remain in the U.S., but then also suggests expanding legal immigration, mostly tied to job-related immigration, by 13%. So we're getting into the part of the program where they get a little harder. So like as you know, as tests for the students, as you take a test, it sort of gets harder as you go. This is probably one of the more difficult ones, and that's reflected in our answers. We're almost exactly split. 56% say Harris, 44% say Trump. Does anyone want to take a bold stance what they think? Whose is this? This is, what do you think, Darren? You're right. That's really the sort of, yeah, this is another Harris policy, it turns out. Yes, Trump has said nothing about expanding legal immigration. And this 13%, I think, comes down to about 50,000 new visas, I believe, annually. So just a very quick rundown here, and there's lots of, immigration is so multifaceted. This is probably really doing a disservice, but these are sort of three big categories people think about: sort of unauthorized immigration, pathways to U.S. citizenship, and then sort of refugees and asylum seekers. You may have seen in the news, even just recently, Trump has sort of come out in favor of sort of mass deportation, potentially using the military, expedited removal, increasing funding sort of for border enforcement, though he did come out very strongly, and you could argue that he sort of helped sort of kill in the Senate the Border Act of 2024, which would have done just that, sort of increased funding for enforcement. Harris has a completely the opposite approach. She sort of suggests limiting deportations and sort of would rather seek diplomacy with migrant sending nations. As she had a recent trip, or at least in 2021, went to Guatemala to talk about just that. In terms of pathways to U.S. citizenship, both support sort of merit-based immigration, which you could think of sort of high-skilled workers or employment-based immigration, though Trump has, Darius said, not come out in any sort of favor of increased legal immigration in terms of like numbers or throwing it. He's come out very much against chain migration, which you could call family migration. And in terms of refugees and asylum seekers, Trump basically has supported completely suspending our refugee program. He has, under his administration, diverted asylum seekers, basically made it so if you were coming to the U.S. seeking asylum, you had to apply to a country you were traveling through first for asylum before coming to the U.S. And Harris is sort of similar, but I guess not quite similar. She said she would be in favor of limiting asylum seekers when illegal crossings are sort of at high levels. I'll just show you a couple of graphs, and then I want to get to our panel. But just to give you a sense of sort of immigration under different sort of presidents. So this is, you could call net migration over time, which is broken up into three categories. Sort of the dark category are lawful permanent residents. Those are green card holders. And the light sort of gray is non-immigrants, excuse me. These might be temporary workers or students who come here for education, not seeking citizenship. And then yellow, this is what the budget office calls other foreign nationals. You could think of this as basically just unauthorized immigration. And so you can see, immigration in total has ebbed and flow over time, but there's sort of a big difference between Trump and Biden here. Under Biden, not necessarily say that this was a direct result of one policy or another, though it certainly could have been. Unauthorized migration was extremely high during Biden, though I'm not going to be alarmist here. If you sort of look at the overall breakdown of where do immigrants sort of come from in the U.S., most come here legally. 75% or so are either naturalized citizens, green card holders, lawful permanent residents, or here temporarily. And then about 11 million or 23% is estimated. This is obviously a very hard number. It's very hard to count sort of unauthorized migration by its nature, like measuring any activity, illegal activity. It's very hard to measure. So this is about 11 million or 23% of total U.S. population. I'm going to sort of, let's just skip over this side. This is just going into sort of more detail about what they did during sort of each presidency. I would like to just point out one thing. I think, to me in reading the news, it seems like Trump deportations is like a main sort of policy point he has with immigration. But if you actually look at the number of deportations under Biden and Trump, it's been roughly similar. It's 1.1 million under Biden compared to 1.4 million under Trump. There's lots sort of to chew on here, and I have some questions here, but I know our panel's going to have sort of some interesting things to bring up, but I'll sort of some food for thought here is how does immigration affect sort of the migrant receiving community? This is what usually gets talked about in sort of policy debates. how are quote unquote native workers affected by more migrants? Are workers substitutes or complements? Do migrants coming here sort of, take American jobs, or do they complement American workers? Is it the case that migrant workers are not doing the same sort of jobs as sort of native workers? Does unauthorized immigration entail risks and inefficiencies? And if we gave sort of pathways to citizenship or some amnesty to unauthorized immigrants, could this improve labor market conditions potentially for everyone, not just immigrants? So I would open up to whatever you feel like talking about, those things or whatever you feel like talking about.
I'll think about the first bullet. And you asked at the beginning, have there been studies? Is there a way to look at some of this? And there have been certainly some natural experiments when you think about Miami and some of the first waves of migration from Cuba. And so you had before and after what happened to employment and different categories. And so there was no evidence in that case that immigrants hurt the community or displaced local workers. There was actually job growth. I'll see if anybody else wants to speak on others before I.
Maybe I'll just say a few things. This is an issue I know a lot more than housing or tax. I worked on these issues in Washington, D.C. for about 20 years, testified before Congress. I was pretty deeply involved in the 2013 effort at immigration reform. I'll just challenge actually the very first bullet point you had there about how this is a presidential area. It's actually under congressional control. So the big things, if you're going to change the numbers, for instance, the level of legal immigration, that's entirely under congressional control. We have not done that in the United States since 1990. And most of the rules that were under were written in 1965. The big issue of legalization, taking the 11 million unauthorized and providing them with some kind of path to citizenship, which was done in 1986 under Ronald Reagan. Included in that is all the DACA folks, the young people who were brought here by their parents. Only Congress can do that, and Congress hasn't been able to do that. So what's happened is that presidents have tried to do things through executive authority. And the approaches of the Biden and Trump administrations are really different. So under Biden, they've gotten a lot harder line on illegal migration, but they've coupled it by allowing a lot more people into the country on a temporary basis. A huge parole program for Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Haitians and Cubans, hundreds of thousands of people coming in a year. They've tried to change. I mean, we kind of all understand incentives and costs. They've tried to change the incentive structure and make it easier to come legally and much harder to come illegally by discouraging people from arriving at the border and seeking asylum there, even though technically they are able to do so, but they're supposed to go to the ports of entry, not cross the border illegally. Trump is the first president we've seen in a long time who really does not like immigration. He wants to see legal immigration be much lower. He wants to close the border with Mexico. And he is talking about the largest deportation we've ever seen in American history. Now, whether he can pull it off or not, we'll see. But the last time we really did a major deportation in the United States was under President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And it was about 1 million people. A lot of them were sent to Mexico, came back illegally anyway, right? There were other ways to get back across. The scale here is something we've never seen in this country. Peterson Institute estimates that at the more extreme ends of it, it cuts about 7% off GDP compared to baseline by 2030. So it has a big economic impact. Hart's point about how immigrants generally complement domestic workers. There have been good studies that when immigrants are either deported or they go underground because they're scared of being deported, that actually costs American jobs. You lose about one, or American native job. I don't like the terminology much, but you sort of lose one American job for every 10 unauthorized that are deported. So there's some real negative economic impact. Sorry to go so long.
I was just going to mention some of the tax implications here. Some interesting statistics from the Tax Policy Center at the Brookings Institution. And, many immigrants pay taxes, right, through sales taxes, through many unauthorized immigrants pay taxes through sales tax, through purchases, property taxes, through their rent, taxes withheld from wages. And actually 2.5 million federal tax returns were filed in 2019 by filers with individual tax ID numbers. So instead of a social security number, this is an alternative number, and with a reported tax liability of nearly $6 billion. So this is something that is often kind of a talking point around immigration is, what is the way that they're impacting and using various programs. So paying taxes is something that many unauthorized immigrants do. And estimates suggest that the undocumented immigrants pay nearly $12 billion in annual state and local taxes as well, for some of the same types of things. And unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for Social Security, Medicare, or SNAP, so they pay to fund systems that they then don't have access to. And this is one element of why contributing, besides kind of contributions related to labor markets, there's been an estimated positive fiscal impact of unauthorized immigrants because of that benefits minus costs.
Or another stray thought, there's debate amongst economists, imagine that. What's the effect of immigration on inflation? There's a lot of correlation when you look at changes in immigration recently and inflation coming back down that suggests they played a role in reducing inflation. There's the disagreement is how strong the causal direction is, but there's another dimension of sort of economic impact there.
Just a couple of thoughts. One is that we have an entire food system that is built on presumptions around the low wages and the poor working conditions that are afforded to undocumented or unauthorized immigrants. And so, to the last question, one question, and I think there's some evidence, this is not my field of expertise, but my understanding is that there's a fair amount of evidence that after the amnesty programs of the Reagan era, what happened was that many of the individuals who were working in those low substandard jobs, they were able to move up. They moved into better working conditions, higher paid jobs. What that did then was not lead to better conditions and better wages necessarily in the food packing or the agricultural sector, but incentives for more unauthorized immigrants to come back in. And so I think any kind of, if we're looking to regulation of the unauthorized workforce as a way of improving labor conditions, including working conditions, you're going to really need to look at enforcement at the employer level, not enforcement at the individual level. The one other thing I wanted to just mention, piggybacking on what Ted opened with, is that who makes these decisions is really complicated because there's both, on the one hand, Congress, Ted is absolutely right to say that Congress has statutory authority over immigration matters. But when you combine that with the fact that we have had decades, and many of us have kind of watched the decades of waves of bipartisan border security bills, that's only the latest, of a thread of comprehensive immigration reform that gets promised, that gets touted, and then collapses to the ground. And in this sort of presence of Congress being unable to develop a filibuster-proof majority to act, you have presidents. We saw this with Obama, who spent much of his presidency saying, I can't do anything, I'm not authorized to do anything, and then issuing the Deferred Action Program in response to demands for more protected status, not pure legal status for folks who came as unauthorized immigrants as young children. The courts have been playing an interesting role, and it will be interesting to see if Trump gets elected. The courts have been very skeptical in some ways of Biden efforts to exert more power in the immigration realm, and whether the courts continue that if Trump is reelected. And then I think the last quick thing I want to point out is the federal government's not the only player on this too, right? In the absence of clear movement at the federal level, we have states acting in different kinds of ways. We have states like Washington that are trying to create more hospitable environments by creating sanctuary measures, by creating kind of access to tuition, protections for college students. And then you have states like Arizona, states like Texas that are pushing the other way. A federalist would say this is a response to different needs, different conditions, but it certainly creates a mess in a context where individuals can move from state to state, and there's tremendous uncertainty.
I just want to add one thing because I don't think we're going to get to agriculture as a topic. So I'm going to insert that is my area of study. And so I want to build a little bit on what Kate said and just insert some thoughts here. So just some statistics here. So about 2/3 of, or a little bit more than 2/3 of our hired crop farm workers in the United States are foreign born, and probably 2/3 of those are unauthorized. And so just to really drive home what Kate said, that our U.S. food system largely relies on our unauthorized immigrants. And in addition to that, that, creates in our food system, both in, on farm jobs and then in food processing, just significant exploitation of labor, of unauthorized immigrants who do not have any kind of legal recourse to then be able to advocate for themselves and to get what we would consider pretty basic worker protections. And so there's some real awful horror stories of the kinds of kind of exploitation that is happening in the United States that I think you would kind of hear that and you'd be like, really, that's happening here? And it is, and it's because they're unauthorized and they don't have those legal protections.
Thank you. You're right. We probably won't get to agricultural, so thank you. Thank you for sneaking that in. I do want to make sure we get to one topic that a lot of people have asked about, and is sort of been in front page of the news recently, and that has to do with international trade, particularly regarding tariffs. So I guess I won't ask this. I'll just ask the audience in general. So who does the U.S. trade with? So I'll ask sort of my first question is, I know we have some trade specialists here, so maybe just to the audience here, what country do we export the most goods to? What is the top export destination? Yes, any guesses? China's number 3. Canada, yes, it's our friendly neighbors to the north and south are our biggest sort of export destinations, to the tune of in the 300 billion range out of a total of about 2 trillion. This is in 2022, $2 trillion of exports. China's there. China would have been probably my guess, not having looked at this, but it sort of makes sense with the proximity we have with Canada and Mexico. And let's go to the other side. What's our top import destination? What's the top country we import from? Yeah, China. And it's not terribly close. China, about $500 billion. Mexico's up there, and Canada as well, and then Japan and Germany, and we have about $3 trillion that we import annually. Okay, well, I don't even know if I should ask this question, but I'll do it just very quickly. Maybe like 10 seconds, I'll have you click it. Yeah, okay, we'll just move. Whose policy is this? Yeah, this is obviously Trump. So no need to ask. So, this is pretty striking, and these are key tenets sort of his sort of trade policy. So tariffs up to 20% on all imports. I'll show you a couple slides in a second. Most of our imports have been sort of strategic in what we import. For example, like why are there like 0 electric vehicles from China in the US? I've never seen an electric vehicle, a Chinese brand electric. They're all over China. You go to China, there's electric vehicles everywhere. Why are there 0 in the US? We have 100% import tariff on Chinese electric vehicle, so you double the cost basically. So, but this was saying, most of and this is under the Biden administration too. So, I mean, most tariffs though are sort of directed in that way. He suggests a 20% tariff on all imports. 60% tariffs are really just taxes paid by the importer to the government, but who really pays a tariff, we'll come back to our panel. He's suggested that tariffs of 60% or higher on all Chinese imports, and then 100% tariff on cars imported from Mexico. A lot of this is sort of repeated here. I would just sort of point out that, I don't want to frame this as, Trump has protectionist policies and candidate Harris has sort of other policies or has other routes. If Harris continues what the Biden administration has done, as I'll show you, there's sizable sort of import tariffs under the Biden administration, more in larger dollar value actually than what was done under the Trump administration. But this sort of like very broad increase is only a tenet of the sort of Trump administration. And again, I don't want to spend too much time. I want to reserve time for our panelists to talk, but just to give you sort of a refresh of what happened under the Trump administration. Large amount of tariffs, about $90 billion in tariffs revenue was collected. Sort of the big thing here is, our increased tariffs on China sort of kicked off this tit-for-tat trade war that disrupted global supply chains, increased prices. And I'll let our panel talk about that a little bit more. But I want to be clear, like a lot of this was continued under Biden. Now, only Trump is sort of suggesting, let's really expand these, let's grow sort of these tariffs. But I don't want to sort of paint it, there's one administration that was the tariff administration, there's one that's not. There's even more tariffs collected under Biden, but you can see these are sort of directed. Here's that, electric vehicles from China getting basically taxed at 100%, why we don't sort of see them at all here. So actually, I want to just sort of jump ahead to sort of the economic implications of potentially a trade war, or when we think about a tariffs, it's been sort of stated by former President Trump that, we're going to have China pay these tariffs. Is that true? Who really pays tariffs? Do tariffs generate revenue for governments? Do they hurt the exporting nation? Just sort of, I think, the goal of a lot of tariffs. Is there any upside to tariffs? Is there anyone who benefits? And then a lot of times tariffs are done to sort of protect a sector. Do they end up actually achieving that end? Or anything you think is relevant? I'll open up to the panelists.
Sure. I mean, there are a bunch of pieces to this. Let me just take a sort of straightforward one on tariffs. I mean, tariffs were historically part of development policies. I mean, the United States had a high tariff for much of the 19th century. And the reason was we couldn't compete with British imports and we wanted to develop domestic manufacturing. Most of the successful Asian nations followed a similar model. So tariffs have their use. The problem is they do all the bad things that Adam talked about. They raise prices for consumers. They're paid by importers. They often result in retaliatory tariffs. I think the strongest argument for tariffs at this particular moment is we're in this massive economic transition to an economy that's really going to look a lot different. I mean, other people on the panel can talk about that if they want, but the new clean energy economy, much more of a digital economy than we had before. China is a leader in a lot of these sectors. If you look at, battery manufacturing, electric vehicles, solar panels, China has a huge competitive advantage, some combination of efficient production and government subsidies. And so if we want those industries in North America, it's hard to see how we get there without some form of tariff protection. At the same time, the Biden administration is spending a lot of our taxpayer money subsidizing these industries. And then there are others for national security reasons like semiconductors. So are you going to dump taxpayer money into those industries and let them get wiped out by lower cost competition from China in particular? So the answer is probably not. You're going to use tariffs for that. So that's what Harris is talking about when she talks about strategic tariffs. So we're going to see tariffs in the next administration. Donald Trump's talking about something much broader, which is across the board import tariffs. I have not seen a good economic case for that. No.
Just a reminder, when there's a tariff placed on the good, it's paid by the importer, as you were saying, or the company that's buying the product from Japan to sell in the United States. So it's paid within the United States. It's not imposed on the other country. The studies that we've seen on the tariff policies, Harris versus Trump, significant inflation expected with Trump policies, and if they are, the modeling is always difficult. If he gets something as broad as he says he wants, you then have to ask who retaliates and how. One scenario is very significant inflation and a reduction in GDP, just because trade going down, economic activity slowing down, not very pretty. I'll keep going, but
I actually have a question because I'm not the economist and I'm not in international trade. So to what extent in a longer term do prices stabilize, right? We talked a little bit about this. I think it was in the housing context. In the short term, certainly tariffs will lead to price shocks, but to the extent that they also protect and fuel development of economies, is it reasonable to expect that we'd see increased supply, and what would that look like, and when would that happen?
I mean, you could answer this too. I mean, I think prices will stabilize, but they'll stabilize at a somewhat higher level. I mean, particularly for a big country like the United States, we are a very productive economy. And so if you have a prohibitive tariff, as we have in the case of electric vehicles, you'll see the development of successful competing products here in the United States. But realistically, they're going to be priced higher than if they also had to face import competition. That's the main argument for doing these trade agreements. You expose, well, there are lots of arguments, but it's a big one. You expose these companies to global competition. That forces efficiencies, which tend to drive down prices. So yes, prices would stabilize, but at a higher level than in a lower tariff world.
I think it's interesting to think about this in a climate context, like some of the, there's the kind of argument that you want to develop U.S. industries in, solar or EVs, et cetera, but how long will that take, and how quickly do we need to act to actually address climate change, right? I think there's a couple other things I want to mention here. One is about going back to just an agriculture example of, in the trade war in 2019, where China placed retaliatory tariffs on exports coming from the United States. Agriculture was highly affected by those tariffs, and there was a brand new program that the Trump administration put in place within the Farm Payment Program called the Market Facilitation Program, and $14 billion was paid out to farmers who were hurt by those retaliatory tariffs. So $88 billion was brought in tariff revenue, but 14 just for one industry, right, was paid out to farmers by the U.S. government under the Trump administration to partially compensate them for those losses, and actually there's a lot of evidence that they weren't fully compensated for those losses that they experienced due to the trade war.
So would you characterize it like a double cost, or almost paying for it twice, or paying it through fewer exports and then paying it through subsidies in some ways, or?
Yeah, I guess you could put it that way. The other thing I wanted to mention is going back to your question about, so this is no longer on agriculture, just about do tariffs help employment in protected areas or protected sectors? I think this is a really interesting question, and actually has to do with the skills that United States workers have. So one of the, I previously worked at Ohio State University, and Intel was building a plant in Ohio, and that's getting a lot of kind of attention. And one of the things that I noticed a lot with the manufacturing that it was occurring in Ohio is that there would be a firm that was incentivized to come into Ohio, and this is true of Intel, they did actually, were concerned about having the workforce with the skills to actually work in that plant. And so then you actually have, going back, this actually connects to our immigration discussion, some of those plants end up being staffed by skilled immigrants who have the technical robotic skills, the various skills to actually do those jobs. So there's also a kind of piece of, if you're going to kind of protect specific industries, where does the skilled workforce come from to work in those industries, EV development? So do we have the educational and skill, kind of upskilling policies in place to complement the protection, the development of those industries?
Thank you. Yeah, any other insights from the panelists? That's, we're going to sort of skip ahead to the sort of big finish. I'm going to ask, here's all we're not going to cover. I will share the slides. Yeah, I'll share all the slides. I also have a document where I've laid out these things sort of in more detail. I'm happy to also share those out as well. But I think the last thing I want to sort of ask, actually just get a read of, I'll ask the last sort of audience participation thing I'll have you click in is, which candidate is projected to add most to our national debt? So which candidate, according to Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania, has done some estimates. Which candidate, Harris or Trump, is projected to add more to our national debt? So I'll give you a second to click in. Just curious to see who. And then we'll sort of we'll wrap it up with a Q&A. Okay, I'm looking here, and this is a much more informed audience than I feel like I was when I sort of started doing this research. 3/4 of you said Trump, which was not what I would have guessed initially in reading sort of the proposed sort of spending policies of Harris, but really it's Trump's sort of spending is not that much less, but his tax receipts are projected to be a lot less. So in terms of adding to our sort of deficit you can think of sort of as a flow, and our debt is sort of like a stock or the larger amount. So an increase in primary deficit is about 6 trillion over the next 10 years on conventional basis. There are estimates that suggest, though, that under sort of Trump's policy regime, GDP would grow faster. And so this would sort of lessen that about $4 trillion if you take into account how behavioral responses. Harris, though, it's significantly less, about 1.2 trillion. But because GDP is expected to grow slightly less, this would probably amount to about 2 trillion, which again, was not necessarily what I would expect. I'll just share one thing sort of about the federal deficit. over time. This is outlays on top, so what we spend, and then green on the bottom is revenues. And what's sort of amazing to me about this graph, like across different presidents, revenues are pretty flat. I mean, it doesn't deviate much from this sort of long-term average. It hovers between basically 16 and 17% of GDP. Not true of outlays. Outlays change a lot from year to year. You can see under the Clinton administration, we had a very brief surplus, but otherwise throughout that entire history, you can see the gap there just represents the adding to our national debt, sort of the rolling deficit there, and then sort of projected here on sort of the end for Biden, but this does not include projections for either candidate, just to sort of give you sort of a sense. We're always running a deficit, essentially, but one candidate is predicted to add more than the other. I would like to stop there and open it up for questions. Please feel free to ask. We'll open up to the audience, and then Darius, I don't know if you could maybe see if there's questions online, but feel free if you have questions about what we talked about or something we didn't get to, please.
Adam, if I can add one thing on the deficit
Yes.
side. No, it's there have been some studies about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, because the proposal was, well, we'll lower taxes, but it will more than make up with growth. So the tax cuts will pay for themselves through long-term growth. And so far, the studies have shown the growth projections to be wildly optimistic. So less revenue, not the growth to compensate. So when there's different models about how debt might grow with Biden, with Harris versus Trump, but it's, what do you assume about the growth? And there's some political
I don't
science
know how much weight we should put into these projections.
And when do you sunset policies? No, they will be.
Yeah. Anyway, I interrupted your questions.
Yep, right there, glasses. Yep. I'll just repeat the question for our Zoom audience. So the question is about under a Trump administration, potentially a Department of Government Efficiency may be run by Elon Musk. This is not something I have expertise in, but I'd invite the panel if you have any thoughts on this.
I can say a couple things about, I teach bureaucratic politics, so this kind of fits under that. Yeah, so Trump has proposed, in his first term as well, he's proposed dramatic changes to the nature of the federal workforce. The federal workforce, I think as many people know, was reorganized way back in the 1920s kind of to provide extended job protections for people, civil service job protections, and Trump has proposed a rollback of those. I think the question of to what extent, and the conversion, he actually put forth an executive order near the end of his term that would have converted many civil service protected jobs into political classifications that would have made them subject to removal by the next political leader. I think, one question, one big question is there are limits to what presidents can do in terms, on the one hand, presidents have a lot of executive authority to make administrative changes to their executive organizations. However, we have Administrative Procedures Acts which argue which require a due process piece, a sort of a waiting period. One of the things we saw in the first Trump administration was that it took a very long time for those changes to actually be, he would announce something, an executive order on tweet, but it would take much longer to actually go through the legal machinery to put those changes in place. So many of his proposed changes either didn't take effect during his term or were still in a review period where the Biden administration could come in and with a sweep of a pen simply erase them. I think the Trump administration or a future Trump administration has learned from that mistake. And so they're likely to be much more savvy about both what can they do that will withstand judicial scrutiny, but also how to put those processes in motion very soon, which will make them harder to change under another administration.
He can't create a new department.
He cannot.
Congress has to do that.
Though, yeah, he cannot create a new cabinet department, but he can, I mean, he can't fund it, but he can create.
Stuff it in the White House.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think, so I think that's, yeah, I don't think he doesn't have the power to create a, cabinet level department of efficiency. He certainly could create a special advisor of a working group on government efficiency that could do all sorts of mischief, shall we say.
And there's a White House usually kind of in charge of regulation. So you can make it, you put it on Musk and that job, which has a lot of power.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, next. We'll go. So the question is about tariffs and how might China retaliate and how might other countries retaliate?
I mean, let me take it broader first with other countries. So last time we're going to use the Europeans as an example. They took a long time to respond. They tried to negotiate with the Trump administration when the steel and aluminum tariffs were put in place. They went through a slow process. There was an article in Politico 2 days ago with European Commission officials leaking saying, we are ready to go. The moment Trump hits us with tariffs, we're going to hit back, and we're going to hit back harder than the US is hitting us. So the Europeans are prepared for a full-on trade war. China's interesting because China imports so much less from the United States than it exports. So tariffs are not quite the leverage for China than they are for us. In the past, and with other countries like Australia and Canada, they've tended to target agricultural imports, soybeans and things like that. But China has other weapons that they haven't used yet. The most important one being export restrictions on products that nobody else is making. Critical minerals being a great example, which are key inputs, not just into our clean energy economy, but into our defense industrial base. A good friend of mine is now the first assistant secretary for the defense industrial base. And she's busy trying to make sure we in the United States and with our allies have the capacity to respond if China in a conflict we're going to begin to cut off critical exports. So I think there's a real possibility that the conflict escalates pretty quickly beyond just tit-for-tat tariffs, and China begins to use other tools to try to hit back at the United States. So that's a scenario that concerns me a lot.
Thank you. I wanted to go to you and then we'll go to the Zoom, please.
Was about how inflation rose so much under the Biden administration, and I feel like there's a lot of talks that keep wanting to reduce that, and then a lot of disinformation is kind of saying the opposite. So what are their policies that they're going to try to use to reduce inflation or stabilize it?
Question is about potentially reducing or stabilizing inflation and what policies could be enacted.
And the preface first, I mean, there's so many tangents to follow with that question. What caused the inflation, or how much did the Inflation Reduction Act contribute to inflation versus all of the other COVID port closures, supply chain disruptions, and so on. But I think getting to the question, presidents don't have a lot of control over inflation. So I think what we've seen is a lot of talk. You want to create a lot of uncertainty or a lot of angst. It's showing up. You've got, I think the Federal Reserve had a poll, 75% of the folks surveyed in the United States said they're doing financially fine or better. If the same people asked, what about your community or local area? It drops below 50%. And they say, what about people, the economy, and the rest of the country? It's about a quarter, right? So everybody is saying, I'm fine, no one else is. And you're creating that kind of angst and uncertainty for political gain. I mean,
I do think there's also a lot of inequality here too. And so it's very frustrating when you are on the lower end of the income spectrum and you hear somebody say, well, yeah, there's, inflation is moderating, it's not a big deal, and you're still like struggling to pay your grocery bill. With some of the policies, and we didn't get to these, but I'll insert this here, about related to this or related to food prices, which are one component of the concerns around inflation, right? And so one of the things that the Harris administration has, a possible Harris administration has proposed, right, is is to implement some price gouging laws. And this has gotten a lot of talk among economists and economists who work on food, because this idea of price gouging, well, kind of, there are policies around this. It's not really an economic concept, right? How high does a price have to be in order to be gouging, right? How high does it have to be unfair? And so sometimes high prices are due to low supply or high demand in a competitive market, right? Is that the same as high prices that are due to a higher markup or the exercise of market power? And I think that's a very challenging thing to think about in the context of like implementing some kind of price gouging policy, though that is something that Harris has proposed. And the other piece of that is Harris has proposed really cracking down on mergers that would allow, for example, there's a Kroger-Albertsons merger on the table that would affect local Hagen stores, among others. And if that merger went through and there was no sell-off of stores, right, the concern is that would allow the larger kind of conglomerate to then or larger company to exercise market power and keep prices high. So then, having some kind of more aggressive merger policy would kind of temper inflation by preventing that exercise of market power. But I also want to mention one other piece, right? The other piece on the other end of kind of how you think about food affordability is not what you do with prices, but what the social safety net you provide to allow people to purchase food when prices are high, right? And so SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, is actually part of the U.S. Farm Bill, and it is our kind of primary safety net around food. And so, one thing to also think about is like, what is each candidate's perspective on that program? And in general, Republican administrations have wanted to put more restrictions on that, on SNAP. And so if that's the primary way that people are paying for that expensive food, then that would differ in terms of how the candidates would respond to inflation.
What happened to grocery store profit margins over the last 10 years?
I'm just going to add one really quick thing, overall kind of macro level. I have never seen an economy in the United States where public perception seems so at odds with what the numbers tell us. Numbers tell us this is about the best economy we've ever had in the United States. You guys are going to be graduating incredibly low unemployment, as low at any time in U.S. history. Inflation has come back down. Wages are exceeding inflation. And that hasn't been true a lot over the last several decades. Wage growth is faster than price growth. Overall economic growth in the United States is beating the rest of the world by a huge margin. We're the most innovative economy in the world. So it is strange, right? I mean, if you look at the numbers we usually pay attention to, it's hard to imagine an economy that's much better than the one we're living in right now. But that's not the public perception, and it's partly why, when Harris gets out on the campaign trail, she doesn't talk that way. She's much more, I understand, you're getting really hit by grocery bills, and you have to do that politically. But it is interesting, the disjunction. Oh yeah, I mean, one other point, that wage growth has been particularly strong at the lower level. I mean, inequality is a massive problem, but it's lessened somewhat over the last 5 or 6 years. So all quite at odds with the political debate.
And I will just say, I think Harris is in a trap, right? You're right to say that she has to say that, but the more she says that, the more that reifies this impression that the economy is in shambles.
I think that was what I was trying to say about your point. The Trump campaign has staked out a very interesting way to keep Harris in a box on this. It's playing on the misunderstanding of the economy and leveraging that. So, but.
Oh, no, that's great. I just want to leave room for at least one Zoom question here. No, thank you. There's so much more to sort of talk about. Here's when, remember when eggs went crazy, here's the price of eggs here, but we didn't quite get to that, but please, stairs. Yeah, that was not Paul's.
Lots of Zoom questions, but one concerns tip income. The question is, could this give businesses an incentive to shift income to become tips, like by recasting real estate commissions as tips? Can the government actually control what items are tips and what are not?
So the question is about tip income. How might employers respond? Might they reclassify certain work, or might they? I didn't quite catch that about the. Oh, I see. Yeah, not pay taxes on it, classifying, yeah, does the government have purview over, or a practical way of controlling what gets counted as a tip? I'd like to say all of my income is tip now,
My income is carried interest.
Yeah, even better. Yeah. But would you like to answer? So the statement from an audience member was about a cost of education, and is there sort of the same? I do want to just briefly answer. I don't know if anyone has something to say about the tip question. Then I would like to come back to this point about the cost of higher education.
Teaching is tipped from the students, right?
Well, I guess
Well,
that
before I hand out grades, I put out a jar.
is there a
Does that count?
is there a panelist that can answer the question? Who determines what counts as tip? Can be a tipped job. Do we know? We don't know.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is we
But this
don't
is
know
something that would be this is a job that maybe was not a very prominent job in the past that would become a very important job if this
job creation.
yes is determining and evaluating what could be tip or not, and if that was not. But
I guess not. There, yeah.
So I wanted to go there. There was a question. I don't know. You didn't say the question, did you?
About
The
higher
quest-
education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
you
guess.
did? Okay. So, no, I just didn't know if you repeated it.
Yes.
I lost track of what had happened. What I did want to say is there are still national service programs that exist in a variety of kind of sectors where if you and maybe some of the folks here can speak to specific ones where if you do certain jobs that are in high need areas that you can have your student loans deferred or forgiven, or there's a variety of different kinds of options. So those programs, while they do probably look quite different than they did in the past, they do still exist, and I don't know that people know about those programs. So
Teaching and healthcare.
yeah, teaching and healthcare are two of the ones that I was thinking about. Doctors, I think in kind of underserved areas is one, and medical school is very expensive, right? So that can be an effective way to pay off medical debt, and then teaching careers, that continues to be an option.
I was also going to say, in Washington State, we know that there is money on the state need grant that goes unclaimed every year. Washington students are not very good about claiming need-based financial aid that's very much on the table. So I think there is money places. Certainly we've seen in public universities, we've seen divestment and sort of a decreasing percentage of state revenues going to support tuition and an increase in dependence on tuition revenues. Sorry, a decrease in state revenues to support the operations of the university, which makes universities more reliant on tuition and more likely to raise tuitions. Though it's interesting, I think, if you dig into the average amount, the average amount of student loan debt is much less than you would actually think. I think it's around $30,000, which it's a big number. It's something you have to pay off, but car loans are also big. And what we've seen is student loan debt tends to be particularly high, and particularly in certain areas. People who go to, particularly not to pick on the online for-profit universities, but students who go to online for-profit universities, and particularly those students who don't finish, right, find themselves with lots of debt and no increase in income to help them pay for it. The other place where you do see a lot of debt, and Zoe kind of alluded to this, right, is in law. People who go to law school, people who go to medical school. In some ways, though, the absolute numbers of that debt are offset by the fact that they're coming out of university or coming out of law school, med school with much greater earning potential, too. Not to say that college shouldn't be more accessible and more affordable, but I think it's important to also keep it in some perspective.
Thank you. I think we do have to maybe wrap things up just for, unless Hart, you had one
Well, I was
last
going to ask you a question of whether the president should have a say over the chair of the Federal Reserve or influence interest rates.
No.
Okay.
So I'd like to say, what in terms of what should be done, I hope we've sort of, informed you at least, but like you go determine it, go vote. I'd like to thank, first of all, the economics department for your support, the Alumni Foundation for helping put this together, and we give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. Please, on your way out, please grab any refreshments or food left over. It probably just gets thrown out, so take it with you, take it home out in the atrium. And if you have more questions or anything, please, happy to answer it. But thank you everyone for coming.